My husband looked straight at me and laughed. "You've gotten old, I want a younger woman." The words echoed through the courtroom more loudly than he probably intended. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a split second before catching up. My attorney slowly lowered his pen. Across the room, my husband sat with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The judge looked over the top of his reading glasses. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, "do you agree to divide the marital assets according to the settlement proposed by counsel?" I folded my hands in my lap and smiled for the first time that morning. "Of course, Your Honor." My husband relaxed immediately. Then I added softly, "But before we do, I'd like everyone to watch one short video." His smile disappeared. "My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old, and until 9 months before that hearing, I believed my husband and I would grow old together. We had been married for 25 years. Not 25 perfect years. No marriage lasts that long without disappointment, compromise, forgiveness, and sacrifice. But I thought ours had been built on something stronger than appearances. I was wrong. I first met Richard in the fall of 1999 at a community fundraiser outside Columbus, Ohio. I had recently lost my first husband to cancer several years earlier, and had finally found the courage to attend social events again. Richard had been divorced for nearly a decade. He was charming without trying too hard, respectful without pretending to be perfect, and he had the kind of easy smile that made people trust him. Our first date lasted nearly 4 hours. We sat inside a little diner drinking coffee until the waitress jokingly asked whether we planned to help close the place. He walked me to my car that evening. "I don't know where this goes," he said, "but I'd sure like to find out." So did I. When we married the following year, we weren't wealthy. Not even close. I worked as an elementary school librarian. Richard owned a struggling construction company with only a handful of employees. We lived carefully. Vacations meant driving instead of flying. Birthday dinners usually happened at home. We celebrated promotions with homemade pie instead of expensive restaurants. Looking back now, those were probably the happiest years of our marriage. We laughed more. We worried less. Our evenings were spent sitting on the back porch watching the sunset instead of staring at separate screens. When business was slow, I balanced our checkbook down to the penny. When one of Richard's trucks broke down, we postponed replacing our own aging washing machine. Neither of us complained. We were building something together, or at least I believed we were. As the years passed, Richard's business slowly grew. 5 employees became 10. 10 became 25. He won larger contracts. Local newspapers occasionally featured his company. Neighbors began calling him successful. Every compliment made me proud. Whenever someone congratulated him, I'd quietly smile from the background. I never needed recognition. Seeing him succeed felt like watching our shared dream come true. At least that's what I thought. Somewhere around our 20th anniversary, subtle changes began appearing. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just little things. Richard bought expensive watches, then designer suits, then a sports car that made absolutely no sense for a man approaching 70. He started spending more time at the office. Business dinners became common. Weekend meetings appeared on the calendar. When I asked how everything was going, he'd kiss my forehead and say, "You know how busy things get." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? 20 years of trust doesn't disappear overnight. Our children noticed before I did. Emily called one Sunday afternoon. "Mom, is everything okay between you and Dad?" "Of course," I answered. "Why, he just seems different." I laughed. "Your father finally has enough money to enjoy himself." But after hanging up, I found myself thinking about her question. Different. Yes, that was exactly the word. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He simply seemed absent, like he had already started living somewhere else while his body still came home every evening. The moment everything changed arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. I had made meatloaf, his favorite. The recipe came from his mother, who had taught me how to make it nearly 20 years earlier. The table was set. Candles burned softly. Nothing fancy. Just dinner. Richard barely touched his food. "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. "I've been thinking for a long time." Whenever someone begins with those words, you already know your life is about to change. He set down his fork. "I want a divorce." I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. "What?" "I've already hired an attorney. 25 years. Reduced to 1 sentence." I searched his face for sadness. Regret? Anything. Instead, I found relief, as though he had finally unloaded a heavy burden. "Richard, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. I could barely breathe. Then he delivered the sentence that would replay in my mind for months. "You've gotten old." He actually shrugged. "I want someone younger." No apology. No hesitation. No shame. Only certainty. I remember looking down at my own hands. Hands that had held his during surgeries. Hands that had cared for his aging parents. Hands that had balanced every family budget. Hands that had packed thousands of lunches and wrapped hundreds of Christmas presents. Those same hands suddenly looked unfamiliar to me. Old. Wrinkled. Ordinary. I whispered. "So that's all I am now?" He didn't answer. He simply stood up. "I'll be staying somewhere else for a while." The front door closed quietly behind him. Silence filled the house. Not dramatic silence. Not movie silence. Just the kind that settles into every room after someone decides your life together has ended. A week later, our daughter Emily arrived carrying groceries I hadn't asked for. She hugged me without saying a word. Mothers usually comfort their children. That afternoon, my daughter held me while I cried like a frightened little girl. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I keep wondering what I did wrong." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. "You loved him." "That's not wrong." A few days later, our son Michael stopped by after work. He looked uncomfortable. "Dad says he wants to keep everything civil." I nodded. "He says fighting will only waste everyone's money." I smiled weakly. I suppose he's right. Neither of my children realized I had already made a decision. Not about revenge, about truth. Because while Richard believed he had rewritten our history, I knew history had a remarkable habit of preserving itself. Sometimes in photographs, sometimes in forgotten documents, and sometimes on a video no one remembered existed. The morning after Richard moved out, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat alone on my back porch with a cup of coffee before sunrise. For 25 years, mornings had belonged to us. He would read the newspaper while I watered the flowers. We'd argue over crossword puzzle clues. He always insisted he was better with history, and I always reminded him I'd been a librarian for nearly 40 years. Little routines. Nothing extraordinary. Those are the things people don't warn you about when a marriage ends. You don't just lose a spouse. You lose 1,000 ordinary moments that quietly became part of your identity. The empty chair across from me felt heavier than any courtroom would months later. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps inside the house. Instead, all I heard was the neighbor's sprinkler clicking across the lawn. The following week, I returned to volunteering at the local library. Most of the staff knew something had happened. Small towns have a way of finding out. No one asked questions. Instead, they did what decent people often do. Mrs. Wilson from the circulation desk simply handed me a blueberry muffin. I baked too many. We both knew that wasn't true. Mr. Hernandez quietly offered to carry a box of donated books that I could have managed myself. People my age rarely need grand gestures. Simple kindness goes much further. I appreciated every bit of it. At home, however, life became strangely quiet. Richard's closet sat half empty. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet. I couldn't bring myself to move it. Not because I wanted him back. Because 25 years cannot be packed into cardboard boxes in a single weekend. About 3 weeks after he left, I received a thick envelope from his attorney. Inside were the proposed divorce terms. My hands trembled as I read them. According to Richard's filing, nearly everything of significant value had somehow become his separate contribution. His construction company, his retirement accounts, several investment properties, even the lake cabin we'd purchased 15 years earlier. The proposal left me with the house a modest retirement account from my years as a librarian and little else. I read the pages 3 times, then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. I remembered exactly where the money had come from to buy that cabin. I remembered writing those checks. I remembered selling something precious so he could make those investments. Apparently, Richard remembered a different version of our life, or perhaps he simply hoped everyone else would. That Sunday, our daughter Emily invited me over for dinner. Her husband grilled hamburgers while my 2 grandchildren chased each other through the backyard. Watching them play reminded me that life keeps moving even when ours feels frozen. After dinner, Emily finally asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Mom, are you going to fight him?" I looked down at my tea. "I don't know if I'd call it fighting." "You know what I mean." "I know." She hesitated. "Dad says you never really understood business." I couldn't help smiling. "Is that what he says?" She looked embarrassed. I didn't believe him. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Sweetheart, your father worked incredibly hard." "He did. I'll never deny that. But businesses don't survive on hard work alone." She waited quietly. "There were years when payroll came before groceries." "I remember. There were years when bank loans were denied. I remember those too. She frowned. I was little. You were? But someone still had to make sure the lights stayed on. Ah, that night I couldn't sleep. So I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were 25 years of memories. Christmas cards, family photographs, anniversary letters, receipts, canceled checks, mortgage statements, even old calendars with handwritten notes. I had never intended to save everything. It had simply become a habit. Librarians don't throw history away very easily. One folder caught my attention. Inside were copies of the first business loan Richard ever received. Attached was another document, a deposit slip. $32,000. My handwriting filled the memo line. Investment from bookstore sale. I closed my eyes. My little bookstore. I'd almost forgotten. When Richard's company nearly failed during our 4th year of marriage, I had sold the bookstore I'd inherited from my aunt. People thought I was crazy. It'll recover, my friend said. Don't sell. But I believed in my husband. The sale gave us enough money to keep the company alive. Richard had cried when I handed him the cashier's check. I'll never forget this. His exact words. I swear, one day I'll make this worth it. Apparently, memories age differently depending on who's remembering them. A month later, I met my attorney, Susan Mitchell. She had practiced family law for nearly 30 years. After reading Richard's proposal, she removed her glasses and sighed. Evelyn? Yes. Is this really everything? What do you mean? Most people don't keep records this organized. I smiled faintly. I was a librarian. She laughed. I suppose that's true. Then she grew serious. Did you contribute financially to the business? I nodded. More than once. Can you prove it? Instead of answering, I slid another folder across her desk. She opened it slowly. Canceled checks. Wire transfers. Loan guarantees. Tax returns. Property deeds. One document after another. She stopped reading, looked at me, then leaned back in her chair. My goodness. What? You've been keeping these for 25 years. I never thought I'd need them. She closed the folder gently. Evelyn, this changes everything. A few days later, Richard called unexpectedly. It was the first time we'd spoken in weeks. I heard you've hired an aggressive lawyer. I hired a fair lawyer, he sighed dramatically. Do we really need to do this? I almost laughed. You filed for divorce. I know. So what exactly are we doing? He paused. I just don't want things getting ugly. I stared out my kitchen window. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked quietly, Richard, do you honestly believe you built everything by yourself? His answer came quickly. I was the one working 70-hour weeks. And I was doing what? Silence. Long enough to become an answer. I don't want to argue. Neither did I. But truth has a way of demanding conversation. At about 2 weeks before the hearing, Susan invited me back to her office. I'd like you to meet someone. An older gentleman stood when I entered. Gray hair. Kind eyes. Well-worn briefcase. Evelyn, Susan said, this is Harold Benson. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Harold had been Richard's accountant during the first 15 years of the company. He smiled warmly. It's been a long time. It certainly has. He sat down carefully. I no longer work for your husband. I heard you retired. I did. He hesitated before asking one simple question. Evelyn. Yes. Please tell me you've kept your records. I smiled. Not proudly. Not triumphantly. Simply with quiet certainty. I kept everything. Harold slowly nodded. Then Richard has made the biggest mistake of his life. Neither of us knew that one forgotten family video would prove even more powerful than all those documents combined. And in less than 3 weeks, the entire courtroom would see why. The closer we got to the hearing, the calmer I became. That surprised everyone around me. Emily called almost every evening. Mom, are you sleeping at all? I am. Really? Really? She paused. I don't understand how you're so calm. I smiled into the phone. When you've spent 25 years telling yourself the truth every day, you're not nearly as afraid of the courtroom as someone who's been telling himself a different story. She didn't answer right away. I wish I were as strong as you. I'm not stronger than anyone else. I'm simply finished pretending. A week before the hearing, Harold Benson invited Susan and me to his home office. Retirement suited him. Instead of fluorescent lights and filing cabinets, he now worked from a converted den overlooking a quiet pond behind his house. The walls were lined with accounting books that looked as though they'd been opened 1,000 times. Harold placed a thick binder on the table. I've been reviewing everything. Susan leaned forward. What did you find? He adjusted his glasses. I found exactly what I expected. He opened the binder. There were years when Richard's company wouldn't have survived without Evelyn's financial support. He turned another page. These deposits match her personal accounts. Another page. These loan guarantees carry only her signature. Another. And these property purchases clearly used proceeds from the bookstore she sold. Susan slowly nodded. This is substantial. Harold smiled gently. It's more than substantial. He looked at me. It's the real history. For a moment, none of us spoke. I realized something that day. The truth doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply waits patiently until someone finally asks for it. So, when I arrived home, I decided it was finally time to clean the attic. Not because I enjoyed cleaning, because I needed something ordinary to keep my mind busy. Old boxes had been sitting there for years. Christmas decorations, Emily's high school yearbooks, Michael's baseball trophies, cassette tapes no one could play anymore, several photo albums. Then I found a dusty cardboard box labeled in my own handwriting. Family videos. I smiled. Richard had loved buying new cameras. Every few years he'd insist technology had improved enough that we needed another one. We had shelves full of DVDs, memory cards, and old videotapes. I carried the box downstairs, mostly out of curiosity. Maybe watching Happier Times would remind me that our marriage hadn't always been ending. That evening Michael came by unexpectedly. He found me sitting on the living room floor surrounded by old photo albums. I figured I'd help. You always hated organizing. I still do. He sat beside me anyway. For nearly an hour we laughed over photographs neither of us had seen in years. Emily wearing braces, Richard trying to cook Thanksgiving dinner one year and nearly setting off the smoke alarm, my late mother teaching the grandchildren how to bake pies. Then Michael picked up one of the DVDs. Remember this? I looked at the faded label. Company anniversary 20 years. Oh goodness. I forgot about that. Richard's company had celebrated 20 years in business with a small banquet at a local hotel. Emily's husband had volunteered to record speeches for the family. We had never watched the video afterward. Life simply got busy. Michael stood. You want to see it? I shrugged. Why not? The television flickered to life. The picture wasn't perfect. The sound crackled occasionally. But everyone was recognizable. Employees filled round tables decorated with blue and silver balloons. Richard looked younger, healthier, happier. He stepped behind the podium while people applauded. I couldn't have done any of this alone. I smiled sadly. I'd heard those words before. Then he continued. In fact, he laughed. The smartest business decision I ever made wasn't buying equipment. It wasn't hiring employees. It was marrying Evelyn. The audience laughed warmly. I felt my throat tighten. On the screen, Richard looked directly toward my table. Most people think I built this company. They're wrong. He pointed toward me. My wife invested every penny she had when the business almost failed. If she hadn't believed in me, there wouldn't be a company. Harold was right. This wasn't emotion. This wasn't opinion. This was Richard's own voice, his own words, recorded years before anyone imagined a divorce. Michael slowly lowered the remote. Mom. Neither of us moved. The video continued. An employee stood to make a toast. Richard interrupted him. No. If we're recognizing anyone tonight, it should be Evelyn. He walked across the room. The camera followed him. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders. This business belongs to both of us. I just happen to wear the work boots. Everyone laughed. I remembered that night. I remembered blushing because I hated being the center of attention. What I didn't remember was that every word had been recorded. So, Michael stared at the television. I completely forgot about this. So did I. He looked at me carefully. Dad said none of that during the deposition. I know. He testified the company was entirely his. I know. He looked almost sick. He lied. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The screen had already answered for me. The following morning I drove straight to Susan's office carrying the DVD. She smiled when I walked in. Find something interesting. I think so. 20 minutes later we were watching together. Neither of us spoke until the credits ended. Finally Susan reached for the remote. Evelyn. Yes, this, she pointed toward the blank screen, is extraordinary. Really, she nodded slowly. Financial records prove contributions. Documents prove ownership. But this, she paused. This is his own voluntary admission. No one pressured him. No attorney prepared these remarks. He wasn't defending himself. He was simply telling the truth. She leaned back. And now his sworn testimony says the exact opposite. That afternoon, Susan asked me something unexpected. Have you watched the rest? The rest? The family videos? I shook my head. There are dozens. I think you should. So I did. For the next 2 days, I watched 25 years of my family's life. Christmas mornings, graduations, barbecues, birthday parties, camping trips, ordinary moments. Then, during a 4th of July picnic nearly 12 years earlier, another recording stopped me cold. Richard stood beside our son near the grill. Michael asked. Dad, whose idea was it to buy the lake cabin. Richard laughed. Your mother's. Best investment we ever made. What if she hadn't sold the bookstore? He didn't even hesitate. Then we probably would have lost everything. He looked directly into the camera. I owe that woman more than I can ever repay. I covered my mouth. Not because I was crying. Because I couldn't believe the man sitting across from me in court had once spoken with such gratitude. Somewhere along the way, success hadn't simply changed him. It had erased his memory of the people who carried him there. 2 days before the hearing, Susan carefully copied every relevant clip onto a single flash drive. She labeled it simply, Exhibit 14. No dramatic title. No tricks. No editing. Only complete unaltered recordings with original dates intact. As she handed it to me, she smiled. You know what's remarkable? What? You never went looking for revenge. I thought about that. She was right. I hadn't searched for evidence to destroy Richard. I had simply opened a box of family memories. The truth had been waiting there all along. Neither of us could have imagined what would happen once the courtroom lights dimmed. And the judge pressed play. On the morning of the hearing, I woke up before dawn. Not because I was nervous, because after months of uncertainty, I finally knew that whatever happened that day, I wouldn't spend another night wondering whether I had done enough. I made my bed, watered the flowers, fed the birds that visited my backyard every morning. The Cardinals had been coming for years. They didn't know my marriage was ending. They didn't care about courtrooms or legal documents. Life simply kept moving. There was something comforting about that. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit I'd worn to Emily's wedding years earlier. Nothing expensive. Nothing flashy. Just something that reminded me I had lived through joyful days before this one. When I looked in the mirror, I saw exactly what Richard had mocked. Gray hair, fine lines around my eyes, wrinkled hands. I smiled anyway. Those lines had earned every year they represented. I wasn't ashamed of a single one. The courthouse in downtown Columbus was already busy when Susan and I arrived. Families waited quietly in the hallway. Lawyers hurried between courtrooms carrying thick files. A young couple sat on a wooden bench, avoiding eye contact with each other. An older man nervously paced while reading papers. Divorce looked different on every face. Pain never follows just one pattern. Susan touched my elbow. Ready? I think so. If at any point you need a break, just tell me. I'll be all right. She smiled. I know you will. Richard was already inside. His tailored charcoal suit looked brand new. His silver watch caught the courtroom lights every time he moved his arm. Beside him sat his attorney Daniel Pierce, a well-known divorce lawyer in our county. Behind them I noticed a familiar face, a woman in her mid-30s. Beautiful. Elegant. She wore a cream-colored dress and sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't smiling. I realized she must be the woman Richard had chosen over me. For a brief moment our eyes met. There was no anger in hers, only uncertainty. It occurred to me that she probably believed everything Richard had told her. That he had built his company alone. That I had contributed very little. That he had remained trapped in an unhappy marriage. If those were the stories she had heard, I couldn't entirely blame her. She had only known one version. I knew another. The judge entered promptly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. After the usual formalities, both attorneys presented opening statements. Daniel spoke first. He painted a simple picture. My client built a successful business through decades of hard work. He respectfully requests an equitable distribution consistent with his individual contributions. Individual. The word lingered in my mind. Susan stood next. Her voice remained calm. This case is not about punishing success. It is about recognizing truth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone of bad character. She simply described 25 years of shared effort. When she finished, the judge nodded thoughtfully. Then he looked toward me. Mrs. Carter. Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand the proposed property division? I do. Do you agree with it? I folded my hands together. Of course. Across the room, Richard visibly relaxed. Daniel even reached for his pen, assuming the matter was nearly finished. Then I continued. But before I answer completely, I'd like the court to see one exhibit. Susan stood immediately. Your Honor, we'd like to introduce Exhibit 14. Daniel frowned. We've already exchanged exhibits. We have, Susan replied. This exhibit was timely disclosed. The judge glanced at the paperwork before him. It appears to have been. Daniel looked mildly irritated but didn't object. The judge nodded. Very well. What is Exhibit 14? Susan looked toward the court clerk. A recorded family video. Richard's expression barely changed. For the first time that morning, he looked curious instead of confident. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. The clerk inserted the flash drive into the courtroom monitor. The large screen flickered to life. Old footage appeared. Blue balloons. Round banquet tables. Employees laughing together. Richard's company anniversary celebration. I watched Richard straighten in his chair. He clearly remembered the event. He simply didn't remember the camera. His younger companion leaned forward with interest. The recording began. Richard walked confidently toward the podium. The room on the screen applauded. Then his own voice filled the courtroom. I couldn't have done any of this alone. No one moved. He continued. The smartest decision I ever made was marrying Evelyn. The judge looked up briefly from his notes. Richard shifted uncomfortably. On the video, he smiled proudly. My wife invested every penny she had when this company nearly failed. If she hadn't believed in me, there wouldn't be a company. Silence. Complete silence. The only sound in the courtroom came from the speakers. Richard swallowed hard. Daniel slowly lowered his legal pad. The young woman sitting behind Richard looked from the screen to Richard, then back again. Her face had begun to change. Confusion replaced confidence. The video continued. Richard wrapped his arm around my shoulders. This business belongs to both of us. I just happened to wear the work boots. Several people in the courtroom instinctively glanced toward Richard. He stared straight ahead. His jaw tightened. The recording ended. No dramatic music. No editing. Only the quiet click of the screen returning to black. So, da is dauantiquant. The judge removed his glasses. Mr. Carter. Richard cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Was that recording authentic? Yes. You were speaking voluntarily? Yes. No one instructed you to make those statements? No. The judge nodded slowly. I see. Daniel leaned toward his client and whispered urgently. Richard whispered something back. Neither looked comfortable anymore. Susan stood again. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we have additional clips. The judge nodded. Proceed. The second recording appeared. A 4th of July picnic. Children running through sprinklers. Hot dogs sizzling on the grill. Michael's younger voice asked. Dad, what would have happened if Mom hadn't sold the bookstore? Richard laughed naturally. We probably would have lost everything. He smiled into the camera. I owe that woman more than I can ever repay. The video stopped. Again, silence. The judge folded his hands. Mr. Carter, your sworn financial affidavit suggests your business was created entirely through your independent efforts. Richard hesitated. My meaning was... The judge interrupted gently. I'm asking a simple question. Which statement is true? The one you voluntarily made for your family, or the one you made under oath in this courtroom? Richard opened his mouth. Closed it again. No answer came. The courtroom remained still. Not because anyone enjoyed watching a man cornered. Because everyone recognized the same thing at the same moment. The truth doesn't become less true simply because someone later finds it inconvenient. Mo. Susan quietly handed another folder to the judge. Our documentary evidence corresponds directly with the admissions made in the recordings. The judge spent several minutes reviewing canceled checks, loan documents, property records, and investment transfers. Every few pages he glanced toward Richard. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Pierce. Daniel stood. Yes, Your Honor. I believe we may have an issue regarding the accuracy of prior financial disclosures. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand the court's concern. For the first time since Richard filed for divorce, no one in the courtroom was talking about how old I looked. They were talking about honesty, and the hearing had only just begun. The hearing did not end that afternoon. Contrary to what television dramas often portray, judges don't usually make life-changing decisions within a few dramatic minutes. They ask questions. They review evidence. They make certain the facts support the conclusions. Judge Margaret Holloway was no different. She leaned back in her chair and closed the thick folder in front of her. I'm continuing this matter for further financial review. Richard's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, she replied politely but firmly. She looked directly at Richard. Mr. Carter, your recorded statements and your sworn financial disclosures appear to be inconsistent. Then she turned toward both attorneys. I expect complete documentation regarding the acquisition of every disputed asset. She glanced down at her calendar. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks. The gavel struck softly. We are adjourned. No one rushed toward me afterward. There were no reporters waiting outside. No dramatic applause. Just ordinary people quietly leaving another day at the courthouse. I preferred it that way. Susan gathered our files while I slipped my coat over my shoulders. You handled yourself beautifully, she said. I wasn't trying to perform. I know. She smiled. That's exactly why the judge listened. As we stepped into the hallway, I heard someone call my name. Evelyn. I turned. It was Daniel Pierce, Richard's attorney. He looked older than he had just a few hours earlier. I wanted to say something. I waited. He hesitated. I had never seen those recordings. I assumed you hadn't. If I had... He stopped himself. Professional ethics prevented him from saying too much. Instead, he simply nodded. I wish you well. You too. He walked away without another word. For the first time, I realized something important. Not everyone standing beside Richard agreed with what he had done. Some had simply believed the version of events he presented. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt cooler than it had that morning. Emily hurried toward me. She had waited outside because she couldn't bear sitting through the hearing. Mom, she hugged me tightly. How did it go? I smiled. The truth finally had a chance to speak. She looked at Susan. Susan laughed softly. That's probably the best summary. Michael joined us a few minutes later. His expression carried both relief and regret. I watched the second half from the gallery. I nodded. I know. He looked down at the sidewalk. I'm ashamed. Of what? I believed Dad. You were his son. I still should have asked more questions. I placed my hand on his shoulder. No. You loved your father. There's nothing shameful about that. He looked up. But I doubted you. I smiled gently. Families make mistakes. The important part is what we choose after we recognize them. 3 days later, Susan called. The judge has appointed a forensic accountant. I nearly laughed. A forensic accountant? Yes. They'll review every business record, property purchase, investment account, and financial transfer. How long will that take? Probably several weeks. And if everything matches our records, it will. She sounded unusually confident. Richard underestimated 2 things. What? Your memory. And your filing system. For the first time in months, I laughed without forcing it. No, the investigation stretched into nearly 2 months. Life settled into an unexpected rhythm. Every Tuesday, Susan updated me. Every Thursday, Emily came over for dinner. Every Saturday, I volunteered at the library. I refused to let the divorce become my entire identity. One afternoon, while shelving books, Mrs. Wilson smiled at me. You seem lighter. I feel lighter. Everything settled. Not yet. Then why do you seem happier? I thought about the question. Finally, I answered honestly. Because I'm no longer carrying someone else's version of my life. She nodded thoughtfully. I understand exactly what you mean. I suspected she did. Most people over 60 have lived long enough to know what it's like to be misunderstood. In early December, Susan called again. This time, her voice carried excitement. The report is finished. And you were right. What did they find? More than anyone expected. The forensic accountant had confirmed nearly every major point we had argued. The company had received substantial financial support from my personal assets during its earliest years. Several investment properties had been purchased using proceeds from accounts held jointly during our marriage. The lake cabin had been partially funded through money traced directly to the sale of my bookstore. Even more troubling, Richard had failed to disclose 2 investment accounts worth several $100,000. Susan paused before continuing. The judge isn't going to like that. Neither was I. Not because of the money. Because after 25 years together, Richard had chosen deception instead of honesty. That realization hurt far more than any financial statement. The final hearing took place just before Christmas. This time the courtroom felt very different. Richard looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped. The confidence that had filled him during our first hearing had quietly disappeared. The younger woman wasn't there. I noticed immediately. I didn't ask why. It wasn't my place. Judge Holloway entered carrying the forensic report. She spent nearly 15 minutes summarizing its findings. No one interrupted. Finally, she looked directly at Richard. The evidence establishes that Mrs. Carter made substantial financial contributions throughout the marriage. She turned another page. It also establishes that marital assets were materially understated during these proceedings. Richard lowered his eyes. The judge continued. Accordingly, she outlined her ruling carefully. The business would remain Richard's. She had no interest in dismantling the company or jeopardizing the livelihoods of its employees. Instead, its value would be fairly calculated. I would receive my lawful share. The investment properties would be divided equitably. The lake cabin would be sold unless we reached another agreement. My retirement would remain untouched. Richard would reimburse my legal fees. Most importantly, the court formally recognized my financial and non-financial contributions throughout the marriage. When Judge Holloway finished, she looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter. Yes, Your Honor. I hope this judgment allows you to move forward peacefully. It does. Then she looked at Richard. Mr. Carter. He slowly stood. I encourage you to remember something. The law measures financial contributions, but a successful marriage is built on many forms of work. Her words hung quietly in the courtroom. No lecture, no humiliation, just wisdom earned through years on the bench. As everyone began gathering their papers, I noticed movement near the courtroom door. The younger woman had quietly stepped inside. Perhaps she had arrived late. Perhaps she had only wanted to hear the outcome. She looked toward Richard. He looked back. Neither of them spoke. She slowly removed the engagement ring from her finger, placed it in his hand, then walked away. No shouting, no tears, no dramatic scene. Only the quiet ending of another illusion. I didn't feel victorious watching her leave, only sad. She too had believed a story that wasn't true. As I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, I realized something unexpected. Justice had brought me peace, but it hadn't brought me joy. Because real victory was never about watching Richard lose. It was about finally reclaiming the truth of the life we had actually lived. Christmas arrived quietly that year. For the first time in 25 years, I didn't hang Richard's stocking over the fireplace. I held it in my hands for several minutes before placing it inside a cedar chest in the guest room. Not because I hated him. Not because I wanted to erase him. Because some traditions belong to a season of life that has already ended. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply learning how to live differently. Emily insisted that everyone celebrate Christmas at her house. No arguments, Mom. I'm bringing dinner to you this year. I laughed. When did you become the parent? The day you forgot to buy wrapping paper. I did not. You absolutely did. For the first time in months, our laughter came naturally. There was no pretending. No carefully avoiding painful subjects. Life was beginning to make room for happiness again. The grandchildren decorated cookies while Christmas music played softly in the background. Watching them smear frosting everywhere except the cookies reminded me that joy rarely arrives in perfect form. Sometimes it wears sticky fingers and too much red icing. Richard wasn't there. The children had invited him. He declined. Michael told me later that his father claimed he was too busy. We both knew that wasn't true. Sometimes shame keeps people away far more effectively than a crowded schedule. I prayed that one day he would stop hiding. Not for my sake. For his own. And January brought another surprise. I received a letter from Harold Benson. Inside was a handwritten note. Dear Evelyn, I wanted you to know how proud I was of the dignity you showed throughout this process. I've spent 42 years watching people destroy each other over money. You never did. You simply defended the truth. There's an important difference. I hope you enjoy the years ahead. You've earned them. Your friend, Harold. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside my wedding album. Oddly enough, it belonged there. Not because it celebrated my marriage, because it honored the honesty that survived after my marriage ended. By early spring, news around town began changing. Not gossip. Just ordinary business conversations. One afternoon, I stopped by the hardware store to buy flower seeds. The owner recognized me. Mrs. Carter. Good afternoon. He hesitated before speaking. I heard Richard's company lost the hospital renovation contract. I hadn't heard. They gave it to another contractor. I'm sorry to hear that. And I meant it. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about all those employees. Many had worked for Richard for decades. They had families, mortgages, grandchildren of their own. I didn't want the company to fail. Justice had never required that. Later that week, I learned 2 longtime project managers had retired earlier than expected. Another estimator accepted a position with a competing firm. The business wasn't collapsing, but it was changing. Trust once damaged rarely returns overnight. One afternoon, Michael stopped by carrying 2 cups of coffee. I figured we should talk. We sat on the porch watching squirrels race across the yard. He looked uncomfortable. I had lunch with Dad yesterday. I waited quietly. He doesn't seem like himself. What do you mean? He barely talked. Michael stared into his coffee. He asked about you. What did you tell him? That you're volunteering again. That you're gardening. That the grandkids keep stealing cookies from your kitchen. I smiled. And he cried. I turned toward my son. Your father cried. Michael nodded slowly. I've never seen him like that. What did he say? He kept repeating the same sentence. Michael swallowed hard. I threw away the only person who believed in me before anyone else did. The words settled over us like a soft rain. I closed my eyes. For years I had imagined hearing Richard admit the truth. I thought it would feel satisfying. Instead, it felt heartbreaking. A month later, Emily invited me to attend Lily's school concert. Richard came too. It was the first time we'd seen each other outside court. We arrived separately, sat several rows apart. Neither of us wanted our granddaughter distracted by family tension. After the concert ended, Lily ran toward us. Grandma! Grandpa! Without thinking, she grabbed both of our hands. Did you hear me sing? You were wonderful, I told her. The best singer there, Richard added. She beamed. Children have an extraordinary gift. For a few brief moments, they remind adults what matters most. When Emily called Lily over for pictures, Richard remained beside me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he broke the silence. You look well. So do you. It wasn't entirely true. He looked thinner, older, more tired than I'd ever seen him. Success had once made him stand taller. Regret seemed to have bent his shoulders. I've been meaning to call. You didn't. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I would have. He looked surprised. I don't hate you, Richard. He stared at the floor. I know. I hate what happened. That's different. He nodded slowly. I've had a lot of time to think. I imagine you have. I became someone I don't recognize. I didn't disagree. There was no need. He already knew. A few weeks later, Michael invited both of us to his house for our grandson Noah's birthday party. He called beforehand. Mom, yes. I know this is awkward. It doesn't have to be. You'd really be okay if Dad came. Of course. This day isn't about us. When I arrived, Richard was already there helping Noah assemble a bicycle. He looked nervous when he saw me. I simply smiled. Need another wrench? He blinked. Actually, yes. For the next 15 minutes, we quietly assembled a bicycle together. Not as husband and wife, not as enemies. Just as 2 grandparents trying to tighten training wheels correctly. Emily watched from the kitchen window. Later, she hugged me. I didn't think this day would ever happen. I kissed her forehead. Families heal one ordinary moment at a time. That evening, as everyone prepared to leave, Michael walked me to my car. You know what I've learned? What? I spent months believing this story was about divorce. He shook his head. It wasn't. It was about pride. I looked back toward the house where Richard stood waving goodbye to the grandchildren. Yes, I said quietly. And pride always charges a higher price than anyone expects. Almost a year passed before Richard asked to see me. Not through an attorney. Not through our children. He called my cell phone himself one quiet Tuesday afternoon. I almost didn't recognize his voice. It sounded softer somehow. Less certain. Evelyn. Hello, Richard. I hope I'm not bothering you. You aren't. He hesitated for several seconds. I was wondering, his voice caught, if you'd be willing to have coffee with me. Not dinner. Not a conversation about getting back together. Just coffee. For reasons I couldn't entirely explain, I said yes. Oh, we met at the same little diner where we'd shared our first date more than 25 years earlier. Very little had changed. The booths were still covered in faded burgundy vinyl. The waitress still carried a coffee pot as though it were part of her arm. The pie display still tempted every customer who walked through the door. I arrived first. Old habits die hard. A few minutes later, Richard walked in. For a moment, I barely recognized him. He looked older than he had only a year before. Not because of gray hair. We'd both earned that long ago. It was something behind his eyes. Humility. Regret. Loneliness. He smiled uncertainly. Thank you for coming. I said I would. He sat down across from me. The same booth. The same window. 2 very different people. The waitress poured our coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, Richard took a deep breath. I've practiced this conversation 100 times. And none of them sounded right. I smiled gently. Then don't practice. Just tell the truth. He nodded. I should have done that a long time ago. For a full minute, neither of us spoke. Then he looked directly at me. I've apologized to the children. They told me. I needed to apologize to you. I quietly waited. I spent months trying to understand what happened to me. I still don't completely know. I became obsessed with staying young. He laughed bitterly. I bought expensive watches, sports cars, tailored suits. I convinced myself that if someone younger admired me, it meant I wasn't getting old. He looked down at his hands. But growing older wasn't what frightened me. What frightened me? I was admitting I couldn't stop time. I listened without interrupting. There was nothing left to argue about. He continued. So I blamed you. You became the mirror that reminded me of my own age. His voice cracked. And that wasn't fair. No, I said quietly. It wasn't. He wiped his eyes. I didn't leave because you weren't enough. I left because I wasn't honest with myself. For the first time in many months, I truly saw the man sitting across from me. Not the husband who had humiliated me. Not the businessman who had lied in court. Not the stranger who had chased youth. I saw a frightened older man who had made terrible choices trying to outrun something no one ever escapes. Time. We all lose that race eventually. Some of us simply lose it more gracefully than others. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I never said that. He looked surprised. I forgave you months ago. You did. I had to. If I carried bitterness into every morning, you would still be controlling my life. He lowered his head. I don't deserve that kindness. Forgiveness isn't earned. It's chosen. He looked at me for a long time. I don't deserve you. I smiled softly. No. You don't. Then I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. But neither of us deserves to spend whatever years we have left chained to the worst thing we've ever done. His shoulders began to shake. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard cried without trying to hide it. Spring slowly turned into summer. Life settled into a rhythm I never expected to enjoy. I expanded my volunteer hours at the library. Mrs. Wilson convinced me to start a weekly reading hour for children. Every Thursday afternoon, a circle of little faces gathered around me while I read stories about courage, kindness, and honesty. Children ask remarkable questions. One little boy raised his hand after a story about forgiveness. Can people really change? The room became very quiet. I smiled. They can. But only after they're honest about who they've been. I realized I wasn't speaking only to him. I was reminding myself. Our family gathered for Thanksgiving that November. For the first time since the divorce, everyone sat around the same table. Emily carved the turkey. Michael insisted on making mashed potatoes even though he still added too much butter. The grandchildren argued over who got the last dinner roll. Richard arrived carrying 2 homemade pumpkin pies. I baked them myself. Emily laughed. They're probably terrible. They weren't. They were slightly overcooked around the edges. Nobody cared. Halfway through dinner, Noah looked around the table. I'm glad everybody's here. Simple words. Profound truth. The adults fell silent for a moment. Not because the pain had disappeared. Because healing had quietly taken its place. Healing doesn't erase scars. It simply teaches you that scars don't have to hurt forever. When dinner ended, Richard helped me carry empty serving dishes into the kitchen. As we stood alone for a moment, he quietly said, I still think about that courtroom. So do I. I thought that video ruined my life. He smiled sadly. But it didn't. It saved what little honesty I had left. I nodded. The truth usually does. He looked at me. I hope one day the grandchildren remember us kindly. They will. How can you be so sure? Because they'll remember what happened after the divorce. They'll remember that we chose respect over hatred. They'll remember that adults can admit mistakes. And they'll remember that families don't have to stay broken forever. He smiled through tear-filled eyes. I hope you're right. I know I am. As I look back now, people sometimes ask whether I regret playing that video in court. My answer is always the same. No. Not because it helped me receive a fair settlement. Not because it exposed Richard's lies, but because it protected the truth. A marriage is more than a list of financial transactions. It's thousands of unseen acts of love. Early mornings, late nights, shared burdens, quiet sacrifices. Those things deserve to be remembered honestly. Growing older is not something to fear. Every wrinkle tells a story. Every gray hair marks a lesson. Every year shared with someone you love has value, even if the relationship doesn't last forever. If my story has taught me anything, it's this. Never measure your worth by someone else's ability to appreciate you. People may forget your sacrifices. They may rewrite history. They may even convince themselves that they succeeded alone. But the truth has remarkable patience. It waits quietly until the day someone finally asks to hear it. And when that day comes, you don't need revenge. You only need the courage to let the truth speak for itself. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll share your own thoughts or experiences in the comments. Someone reading them may find the encouragement they need today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that comes with life's later chapters, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. Until then, take good care of yourself and never forget that a life built on integrity is a life that can never truly be taken away.